Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Hello, my name is Suzanne Modell, and I'm chair of the Program Committee of Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods, a Southern California retirement community. Several months ago, Concerned Citizens invited Frank Wilderson to give a lecture about his new book, Afro-Pessimism. But today is May 15th, 2020, and America is in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. Since the pandemic renders an in-person presentation impossible, Dr. Wilderson kindly agreed to this videotaped presentation. Frank Wilderson is a writer, poet, and critic, as well as professor and chair of African American Studies at University of California, Irvine. He holds a BA from Dartmouth, an MFA from Columbia, and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. In his 20s, he spent several years as an activist and teacher in South Africa. Before publishing Afro-Pessimism, his new book, about which we will speak today, he published the prize-winning Incognegro and a book on cinema entitled Red, White, and Black. Welcome, Professor Wilderson.
Thank you, Suzanne. And since you and I have had so many productive conversations together, let's both be on first name here. I don't want to go back to Dr. Moto and Dr. Wilderson. Okay.
That's absolutely fine. Actually, that was one of the questions I did want to ask you, how we should proceed on that.
Yes.
So maybe to begin, could you tell us a little bit about what it's like to release a book during a pandemic?
Well, it's a bit daunting. This is my third book, as you said, and I had a whole tour lined up, from the West Coast to the Midwest to the East Coast to various parts of Europe, and then South Africa was being talked about. So I just had a lot of events that had to be canceled, and but as they were canceled, fortunately, and I highly recommend writers hooking up with a PR firm. I was a little loath to do that because you pay out of pocket for that, and they range anywhere between $9,000 to $20,000 for 6 months of work. But I bit the bullet and paid the money, and I was really fortunate to be working with Gretchen Crary of February Media, in addition to Peter Miller, who's inside of Norton, the preps that published my book. And what they did together is they just reconstituted this whole events, a series of this book tour that was going to span the country and then Europe, into online presentations. And I also had the help of Elizabeth Cole of Evil Twin, who's normally my speaking tour agent. And the interesting thing is that some of the Zoom events have had more people than could possibly have been in an auditorium had I been elsewhere. So I was expecting crowds of between 80 to 150 people. Now some of these events on Zoom and Crowdcasts are getting like over 300 people on them, and then they're recorded like yours, and people look later. So I think I don't like the change, but I think we've adjusted. The technology wasn't here 10 years ago to do it like this, but I still feel for independent bookstores, for example, and because everyone's thinking they have to go through Amazon or whatever, and I also feel for I really like the personal contact of being in an auditorium, like I was, I think it was 12 years ago, in your auditorium at Laguna Woods, when I presented on my first book, Incognito, in conjunction with a talk about Mandela and Obama. So I really miss that Laguna Woods. There was, I think, about 100 or so people there. And it was a very robust Q&A afterwards and a very nice book signing. So that I miss.
Great. Okay, well, I'm sorry that we can't do that this time. That was actually why we invited you, because we had good memories. So let's see how well we can do together now. To begin, why don't you tell us something about the book, about its central argument? What are you trying to tell, and why did you write it?
Afro-Pessimism is a strain of critical theory. And what critical theory strives to do is to generalize an explanation of what it means to be a relational being. So it's a highly intangible set of principles. And so one big arena was psychoanalysis, and the kind of psychoanalysis grounded in the work of Levi-Strauss. So that's one area. The other area would be political economy, and the kind of political economy grounded in the work first of Karl Marx and Engels, and then in Antonio Gramsci. And so most people in the world are mobilizing what they think about suffering through the assumptive logic of either one of those two large master narratives. Even if they have not read Das Kapital, they still internally, you can do it as a rhetorician. What we do are like symptomatic reads of what anyone says. And what you could do through a symptomatic read is you could see, based upon the points of attentions, the selection of topics, the distribution of concerns, you could actually break down anyone's book or article to say that in the main, this person believes that the essential nature of suffering is between rich and poor, have and have-nots. Or you could say, in the main, this person believes that the essential nature of suffering is through the artificial construction of gender, which produces artificial categories called man and women. Most people think that these categories are organic, that they're really men, they're really women, that they're really workers and they're really bosses. They don't think of them as being highly abstract constructs that manifest themselves in our lives. But so what we're seeing is that if you take any political movement, and I studied this for 3 months in Germany in Italy, long before I went to Germany. What you can see is that for any political movement, the people are marching on the ground, even if they haven't read the texts of their movement, have a belief. And the belief is that this is what organizes suffering. Most people believe that what organizes suffering is economic disparity, which would be a Marxist lens, even if they're progressives and not Marxists. And I had this debate with people at Laguna Woods 12 years ago. And so what we were saying is that suffering is, those ideas of suffering are really important, but there's another essential nature to suffering. And so what we like about Freud, Lacan, Strauss, and all these other people on the side of psychoanalysis is that they don't use any words that they take to be organically meaningful. They would never use the word man or woman and say that that means something. What we like about Marx and theoretical Marxists, they don't use any words that they take to be organically meaningful. They would not say or boss and say that those words are phenomenologically in the world. They say they're constructs that come to us through mass amounts of violence. And then they enter our minds after generations as though they are real. And so what we were saying is that we agree with all that, but there's one besetting hobble to all foundational narratives for struggle. And that besetting hobble is that every one of these people believe that the word human actually has a meaning, that the word human is organically situated in the world. And so we decided to break that apart and one of the things that we found is that the word human is structured in the end by its antithesis. I'll stop there because what we're saying is that the antithesis of the human is the slave. Well, that comes out of Orlando.
It's not the animal. It's not human animal. That's not the dichotomy.
No, I mean, no, exactly. There are capacities that humans have, which is a capacity for reciprocity, the capacity to change time, which is called endless duration, and make it into events on a calendar, events in your life. The capacity to change limitless space and make it into topography, like states and cities. And in order for an entity to have that capacity, to know I have the capacity, there has to be something over here that does not have that capacity. And
that's a logical construct that the mind needs, that somehow in order to know what X is, you have to know what not X is.
Precisely. And that's the first principles of Chomsky's linguistics or semiotics.
Okay, so maybe now, if I might, we could ask you to read that we had pre-agreed on a section to read, because I think to some extent in that reading, you are trying to distinguish the Black experience from that of Native peoples or Pakistanis or women or other quote unquote oppressed groups, yes?
Yes. So this is a little vignette that takes place in, I would imagine this would be like November-ish of 2001, right after the World Trade Center bombing. In this scene, I am 40-something, I think. I'm not doing the math in my head, but I'm a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and I'm coming out of my apartment going to a conference. So I'll just let the rest tell itself. 2 months after the attack on the World Trade Center, an airport shuttle picked me up at my apartment in Berkeley. It was winter, just shy of 5 in the morning. The air was clear and frosty, as Bay Area winter mornings often are. The sun had yet to rise. Winter doesn't deserve its name in Northern California when set against the blizzards of my Minnesota youth. Now, in the early gloaming, broken knees of lightning kindled the blood orange sky above the San Francisco Bay. It was going to rain. Standing beside his idling van, the South Asian driver asked me twice if I was the person going to the airport, as though the wrong person had somehow come out of the right complex, as though I'd called him under false pretenses not to go to the airport at all, but simply to come out at that ungodly hour at 4:55 a.m. to annoy him, if not to rob him. I felt a chill of chastisement in his gaze. I tossed my bags in the back and walked around and slid the door open. In the nugget of light that shone from the ceiling, I found myself face to face with a middle-aged white woman and a hesitant middle-aged and bearded white man who peered at me from her left side. Their excess baggage took up the seat behind them, and we looked at each other with that momentary, familiar, but all too mutual dread as we realized that I was going to sit next to her. I took more than ample care not to touch her thigh as I fished for my seatbelt in the dark. The van nosed down the road through the last seeds of night. The only light on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive came from the intermittent street lamps. We were as quiet as death itself, the driver, the woman, her husband, and me. I felt angry. I had the sense that before I arrived, they had all been engaged in spirited conversation and that it had stopped when I got in. Was I the reason they had stopped talking? Could I be sure that they had been talking? Was this Black paranoia kicking in where a little common sense might be in order? The face of the Pakistani driver when I came out of my apartment was still branded in my brain. Now this quiet discomfort, this silence on my behalf this churning of my gray matter to make sense of it, this doubt that it was anything at all. Not that I want to speak with these Ofes and their junior partner, I thought, but I wanted them to want to speak to me. George here works at Cal, she finally said, stammering. Are you at Cal? I mean, are you a professor or a grad student? No, lady, I'm a crackhead just out on the prowl this morning. That's wonderful, she said. Do you know Judith Butler? I told them a bit about my research, but rather than couch my research project in the language that animated me most, a synopsis of the structure of US antagonisms, I couched the synopsis of my research project in the language that animated me the least, questions of film theory and film historiography. I kept it simple and free of politics. And I think everyone seemed to be relieved. Even the driver smiled at me through his rear view mirror and seemed to be at ease. I'd accomplished the main objective of international Negro diplomacy, make them feel safe. Now the taciturn professor ventured forth. Before you got in, he said, we were discussing this new law, the Patriot Act, ghastly business. Is this still America? This man here, he motioned to the driver who smiled again and nodded at us in the rearview mirror, shouldn't have to come to this country and encounter xenophobia and persecution. What are we coming to? The Pakistani driver then weighed in with anecdotes dramatizing the injustices he and members of his community have been subjected to since the passage of the law. The Patriot Act was 400 pages long, and neither the professor nor his wife nor the driver had read a word of it. I had read 170 odd pages of it and had written a synopsis of what I'd read for some Black folks at a retirement home in Oakland. They too had thought the law to be draconian and unjust. But unlike the people in the shuttle to the airport, they did not think there was anything particularly new or un-American about the new law. The woman at the home, who was 80, had looked at me, shaken her head, and they keep going back to the polls, these Caucasians. They go back to the polls like it matters. But the memory of these Black folks' response to my finding was lost on me as I traveled to the airport, because the people in the van had taken a renewed interest in me. I had advanced from being tolerated to being valued. I was no longer a stimulus to their anxiety. Tonight, I thought, I will be someone to whom the Pakistani driver speaks highly of, to his wife or compatriots. The professor and his wife will talk about me and what I've said on the plane and perhaps at their conference when they reach their destination. My desire was to be the object of their desire. Through my words, a common sense of joy and a sense of common purpose bloomed inside that small shuttle where before there had been dread and division. We were all people, just people, people who demanded the same basic form of fairness and accountability from our government. The thought of sneak and peek searches, the thought of unlawful wiretaps, the thought of expanded prohibitions on our freedoms of assembly, the thought of the government sniffing around at our libraries and bookstores, well, that does it, we agreed. That's taking things just a bit too far. And I was not only part of and party to this multiracial consensus, but it was the miracle of my efforts, my research, my erudition, my labor, and my 52-teeth charm that had sutured this vigorous populism, this fire and brimstone accord in the wee hours of the morning. Not only were they taking me seriously, which is to say they truly thought that I could think, but I was now essential to them. I kindled the fire of their nostalgia for a democratic past, and they seemed to need at the very same time for me to somehow castigate them, beat them, as though only I could fulfill their masochistic urge to hear how bad their future would be. To this end, the woman turned to me and said something like, "Sambo, now don't you spare me, Sambo. You hear? Don't you hold back, Sambo. Tell me just how bad it's going to be." Miss Anne, they don't take our civil liberties and send them way up yonder. The professor sat there shaking his head. Way up yonder. He gazed at the ceiling. Way up yonder. Now the terrain of conversation was cleared once again for the driver. "Let me tell you about my community," he said. Let me tell you the story of wrongful arrests, the detentions without trial. We listened to him from within the folds of our renewed faith in redemption. We were more than a mere collection of common interests. We were an intrepid collection of affect. Our mood and our will meshed into a warm cloth of amen and ain't it a shame. The driver said, I don't know why I ever brought my family to this country. And before I could disentangle the structure of my unassimilable Blackness from the mesh and mush of multiracial affect, I said, me neither. But these words shredded our mood. The earth flipped. We all fell off. The driver said, I don't know why I ever brought my family here. And I had responded, me neither. The van was again uncommonly silent. It was as though a period had been placed in the middle of a sentence. The driver's eyes flashed at me in the rearview mirror. The white woman beside me shifted the way she had shifted when I first got in. My me neither was not being addressed. My me neither hung in the air like a faint but unquestionable foul odor, an unexpected but unattributable fart. To be sure, my odor had been emitted, but it had not been emitted in bad faith. I thought we were one. Surely we could live with my smell. They could live with my smell if I could live with theirs. So robustly had I been held by the South Asians' dilemmas of access to civil society and the good white folks' dilemmas of the relative elasticity or rigidity within civil society that I had forgotten the first rule of international Negro diplomacy: make them feel safe. My presumed embodiment of the tenor of immigration, the presumption that moving from the plantation to the city was a form of immigration, the presumption that I possessed the constituent elements of filiation, my family moved from the plantation to the city, rather than the ruse of borrowed institutionality, and that I furthermore possessed the constituent elements of volition and agency, and I brought my family from the plantation to the city. All this, spoken in my me neither, had somehow tampered with the safety upon which the triangulated goodwill and warm feelings between what Jared Sexton calls citizen, non-citizen, and anti-citizen depended. The white professor and his white wife being the citizen, the Pakistani a non-citizen, and me being the anti-citizen. I had sutured the equilibrium of the universe through my recitation of the dreaded Patriot Act, and then with the same ease and unthinking intuition, I had dared threaten the equilibrium, a fragile universe, by thinking a Black thought out loud. In the 30 seconds of silence, I felt my flesh peel away. With 2 words, my me neither had fallen from grace. I went from warm and fuzzy Sambo to W.E.B. Du Black. The professor and his wife were ready for this ride to the airport to end. But the Pakistani driver had that same kind of new arrival fight in him that the couple had possessed 200 years ago when their people were immigrants. He looked at me unsympathetically in the rearview mirror as if to say, did you make an honest mistake? An honest, innocent mistake, the kind of mistake anyone can make in the joy and euphoria of the moment, or were you fucking with us? Being a smartass whose sole intent was to shit on the inspiration of the personal pronoun we. His eyes flicked from the street ahead to my image in his mirror. Slowly and deliberately, he said, sometimes I want to pack my bags and go back home. No one spoke. No one even breathed. The engine groaned uneasily as we turned onto the exit ramp. I threw down the gauntlet, sat up straight, and cleared my throat. Yeah, too. Yeah, I said, me too. This time, the smell was unmistakable. It was the stench of something burning, a field of cotton up in flames. Into the fire, the professor's wife rushed with the only water she could find. Being homesick, she said. Now there's a universal phenomenon. We've been going to this conference for years and we still miss the kids when we're gone, which is more than we can say for the kids, her husband chimed in. I felt something pressing itself into the palm of my hand as it lay at my side, insisting I take hold. To this day, I don't know if it was the cold, hard door handle or the handle of a blade. The shuttle that I took to the airport in the wake of 9/11 was a microcosm of a captive scenario where Blackness exists inside and beneath the specter of policing, thinly disguised as the work of social movements dedicated to the expansion and democratization of civil society. It shows how in the libidinal economy, in the libidinal economy of values, access to institutionality, universal suffrage, unfettered mobility, etc., when set in motion by social justice initiatives, is predicated on the intensification of Black suffering and death. 4 people rode in that van that morning, but one of those 4 was subjected by a regime of violence that bore no resemblance to the regimes of violence that subjugated the others. The people in the van policed my pain, my bearing witness to the singular structure of anti-Black violence.
Wow. Well, thank you for reading that rather long portion. I hope you're not exhausted from it. I love that section partly because it describes the experiences of several oppressed groups that you put together in the van, but also that you are trying to illustrate what you call the non-Black Black divide, which is to say that you don't see the fundamental antagonism is between whites and Blacks, but between non-Blacks and Blacks. And I might just mention, I don't know if you know my mentor at UCI, Frank Bean, but Frank Bean and Jennifer Lee have written a book that essentially argues that has looked at the history of ethnic minorities and immigration in the United States and comes to the definite conclusion that Blacks are, if you will, in a category by themselves. So with that in mind, I still have some questions, and just to further elucidate your point, you not only feel that Blacks are in a separate category, but you talk a lot about violence and gratuitous violence and the function that violence is almost like necessary in order to maintain this distinction. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, and also a little bit about what you mean by violence. So for example, was the experience in Van already an example of some sort of violence?
Yes, exactly. I think that the violence of no one hit each other or even yelled at each other at the van. So how is there structural violence there? Well, it comes into play with respect to, in order for those 3 people to have a coherent conversation about suffering, they have to intuitively and unconsciously crowd out the imposition of a conversation about a structure of violence that is not like theirs. And this is for those like yourself who are academics and intellectual. I think like Antonio Gramsci, I think everyone is an intellectual. Factory workers, homeless people, everyone's an intellectual. But there are people in every society who are trained to be sanctioned intellectuals. And those are people like, unfortunately or fortunately, you and me, who get PhDs, okay? And so I would say that you have to have violence to set up a paradigm of thought. What I mean by that, if you go to Democracy Now! Or KPFK and you listen to Richard Wolff, you'll understand, or any of the smart people from where you come from, UMass Amherst, where all this work has been done on Marxism for many, many years, you find that the way in which we think unconsciously and consciously today is a function of a cataclysmic overturning of one paradigm of feudalism into the paradigm of capitalism. It would be impossible 500 years ago to have the kind of unconscious anxieties and the temporalities of time that we experience every day before the entire global paradigm of political economy manifests itself through the revolution of the bourgeoisie. So that paradigm came with performative violence, people killing each other. It also came with what we would call the violence of structure, which is, in seeing the violence of structure, it's hard for me to teach this to undergraduates because undergraduates come out of high school with an empirical mindset. And so they have to kind of get out of that, because to see structural violence, seeing structural violence is like throwing paint at the invisible man in order to make him out. You cannot actually see it, but you can see the symptoms of it. You can see that with the Enclosure Acts in the British community hundreds of years ago, making pastures and forests into divided lanes and plots, that was a kind of cartographic violence that forced people through sluice gates that led them into the cities and into factories. And the point that Orlando Patterson, who we borrow from a lot in his book, Slavery and Social Death, he's a Harvard professor, the point that he makes early on is that you can't have a stratified society without massive amounts of violence to set that up. To have a stratified society, you need a lot of violence. But here's what he says. Once that is set up, once people are waking up in the morning and thinking of themselves through the modality of worker, which is to say, in the morning, the anxiety in your stomach is how much do I have to do and how long will I have to do it, which is a different kind of anxiety. It's a global anxiety because you cannot go anywhere now. To have a paradigm, it has to, the relations have to structure the world. Okay, so in order for that to happen, we have this violence. Now, when people around the world have inculcated that, so it's not a part of logic, it's a part of faith, then the violence of the paradigm goes into remission, it goes under the table. You actually don't want the kind of violence that created the paradigm to be operative throughout the life of the paradigm. You want that to come back when people resist. When Fidel Castro resists the American incursion, when workers go on strike, then you bring the Pinkertons in. But in normal paradigmatic situations, which are unethical from a revolutionary standpoint and need to be overturned, meaning from radical feminism and psychoanalysis, the nuclear family needs to be destroyed. From radical theory in Marxism, political economy as capitalism needs to be destroyed. These are not moves to reform the life of people in these. These are moves to destroy the relational dynamic. And in these two paradigms, for example, hegemony is the most operative dynamic after the violence has been set up. So if we can think about that, what I mean by hegemony for people who haven't heard that phrase, Antonio Gramsci, hegemony has three components: influence, which is the influence of a ruling class; leadership, which is the leadership of ideas like meritocracy. No one now, most people don't think meritocracy, that is a capitalist plot. No, people have inculcated meritocracy as being valuable. Influence, leadership, and consent. And that means spontaneous consent. We wake up in the morning and give our consent to it. So once the violence has set the paradigm up and we're all there, then the paradigm needs hegemony, which is to say the consent of people to its values. However, and this is the major breakthrough of this book, Slavery and Social Death. However, the paradigm of slavery never instantiates hegemony. And what that means is that once the slave, after generations of generations, from 625 AD to 1000 AD, once East African Blacks have been formally inculcated into the slave dynamic of the Arab world, and then the Portuguese rock up, and Africans have been formally inculcated to the transatlantic slave trade, and then the 500 years of the Americas. Once that happens, in all other paradigms, the violence that was needed to create it goes away and hegemony kicks in. In the slave paradigm, the gratuitous violence, the ritualistic killings, the bodily mutilation has to continue. And that is the precise crisis at hand in the van, because you have three groups of people, the white man, the white woman, and the colored immigrant, who are all subjected to a violence that we call as contingent. That is a violence that happens when they break the codes of their oppression. When the professor, the male white professor, decides he wants to be a Marxist and organize a union at UC Berkeley, then the state violence comes. When the woman decides to reject the place of the woman in the family and and go for what radical feminists have called the destruction of the nuclear family to instantiate a kind of transgender dynamic, then the violence come in. Once the immigrant rejects the codes of immigration, then the violence comes in. But the point of the slave is that for those things to be coherent, there has to always be a being for whom violence is wanton, not purposeful, and not based upon breaking rules. And so that's the one thing. And the last thing I'll say before I close here is that, and this is where we, as Afro-pessimists, depart from Patterson. What we say is this word called Black is not a cultural word. It is not an economic word. It is a paradigmatic word that you cannot take Black as a word and disimbricate it from slavery. That Black comes into being at the moment there's a global consensus that Africa is the place of slaves. And so Blackness is a site, a position in which there are many different cultures and genders, but it is a position primarily in which where it is where it is embodied. Because you're not going to be, some people are going to be Black in America and they're not going to be Black in Cuba. That's not the point. The point is that Blackness is always the site where contingent violence is not available. That sounds really weird. Blackness is always the site where contingent violence is not available, meaning Blackness is always the site where violence comes to beings because it is needed for the psychic rejuvenation of other beings, not because the Black breaks the rules. So I'll end it right there.
Right, okay. I hope our viewers can grasp this. This is a complex and abstract argument. As I've suggested in some of our correspondences before this recording began, I'm an empiricist. I'm a social scientist, and I crunch numbers and look at facts. So you and I are on a bit on different tracks, but I'm going to try to see if I can engage you by simply asking. So part of your claim is, unlike Frank Bain or possibly even myself, who would argue that the position of Blacks in the United States is definitely something different. That being Black, whether you're a Black immigrant or whether you're a Native African American, your experience in the United States is something off the charts. It's not comparable to Native Americans or immigrants or their descendants or gays or whatever. But you used the word global just recently, and I mean, I do research on Black Caribbean immigrants in many countries, and I would just want to say that my work suggests, and it's the empirical work and others as well, that there's variation in the ways that different societies, thanks heavens, respond to Blacks. We're not all the United States, and perhaps the best example really is France, where, yes, again, I do accept your thesis, or I didn't realize it was Chomsky's, that in order to understand X, you have to have a concept about not X. You have to have that foil to clarify your thinking. But it does not seem to me, let's say, for example, in France, that Blacks hold that position, but rather that North Africans do. By North Africans, I mean Algerians, Moroccans, of whom there actually are a few million that live in France. So how would you respond to the fact that that different societies vary in their response to Black people?
Well, the first thing I would say to my interlocutor is that perhaps the first thing that we have to clarify is that if I am talking, I am not rejecting the difference of experiences, both internal, like people who are in the Western Hemisphere and are Black, speak European languages. And Frantz Fanon, who was a Francophone theorist writing Black and White Masks in Paris, would argue, yes, I am hobbled, Fanon am hobbled, in comparison to Senghor in Senegal, because he speaks Wolof, and he has a kind of connection with an ethnicity that is not ruptured by the slave trade in the same way that mine is. However, he would also say that to have the conversation at that level is to think of Blackness as an identity. And the major intervention of Afro-Pessimism is that we're arguing Blackness is essentially a position. So meaning, first it is a position. So we're not actually poo-pooing or rejecting the arguments that wherever you go in the world as a Black person, there's going to be a different experience, or that Black people from different parts of the world are going to have different experiences. What we're saying is that all of the people in the humanities, which I know best, but I would say, of course, the social sciences, that we haven't actually done the work of clarifying the words that we're using. This is why Afro-Pessimism presents a scandal to the humanities, because the humanities assumes, whether it's philosophy or French or comp lit, that there's this universal entity called the human. And under that umbrella, there are many different genders and ethnicities. And we're saying, wait a minute. And I gave Chomsky a little bit too much credit, because his work is actually building on people from the 19th and late 19th century, with Saussure and Peirce, who are the first people who write on semiotics. But the point being is that you actually have to step back and not accept the meanings of the words that you use until you have actually clarified them before using them. And that for hundreds of years, we've been using this word human, and it's become a word that we fundamentally believe, whether we're intellectuals who are sanctioned and trained like you and me, whether we're common people, lay people on the street, we believe that it has organic meaning. And that's the first thing that has to be disturbed. It does not. The second thing is that a good theoretical Marxist from where you came from, UMass Amherst, which does brilliant work, would never say that a sweatshop worker on the Maquiladora who's dying on the job has the same experience of a professor in Stockholm who has all kinds of social welfare benefits built into his or her life and a lot of free time, okay? They say those two lived experiences are very different, but they also say that is inessential to our discussion. What is essential to our discussion is that structurally they're both workers. When you start talking about their differences as being essential, you're mistaking their identities for their structure. And so structurally, and this leads you into a false hope for social democracy, as opposed to what your hope should be, which is the destruction of capitalism and the instantiation of communism. So this sense that these people live very essentially different lives leads activists to say, how can we then make life better for the Maquiladora workers, which is not a bad thing to do, but it then suggests that making life better is an essential change. No, the change that is needed is to destroy the accumulation of surplus capital, surplus value, to destroy the wage relation. So in order to do that, you have to think at a higher level of abstraction and say, not what is essentially different about the maquiladora worker and the professor in Stockholm, but what is essentially the same. And so what we're saying, if we come back to Afro-Pessimism, is that you could float between countries and continents and have a different experience as a Black person. My friend Jared Sexton has written an Afro-Pessimist book, His Mother's White, His Father's Black, on how this works with multiracial people. But the point of the matter is that everywhere in the world, there has to be a slave in the consciousness, someone outside of the civic life, in order for civic life to have coherence. And in the cab to the airport, the van to the airport, what was happening is that these three people were talking about their different experiences in civic life, and another person, me, was saying, no, I'm outside of civic life. And me being outside of civic life gives coherence to your conversation. And so the argument is that Black doesn't have a place in civic life. Black has to be outside of civic life in order for civic life to be coherent. But different people could or could not be Black depending upon where they are. So I'll stop there and,
Okay. Okay, if I could just still push the envelope just a little bit further. So what about times and places that have never encountered Blacks? I don't know, Russia in the 5th century or something. If you're saying that that this dichotomy is necessary for humans to be humans, to humanize in a way, is this a modern phenomenon? Is this something that is also maybe more related to the emergence of capitalism or some other globalism, and is not, or is it something as fundamental, I would argue, as gender disparities, where we've got that traditional family. We can look anywhere in any society or whatever. That family is there, and it's 99% of the time it's patriarchal. So what about societies that didn't have? Yes, I know we will need to wind down soon. What about societies that had no association with Blacks or sometime in the past? Did they also need this mechanism? Was there something else out there filling the role that Blacks fill now?
Yes, okay, that's a very good question. So a paradigm organizes thought globally for it to be a paradigm. So I would say that in 1869, capitalism is not a paradigm. Why is it not a paradigm? Because there are pockets of the world where the capitalist relation does not exist. But at least by when Marx dies and we get to the end of the 19th century, you just can't go anywhere in the world and be outside of the capitalist relation. Okay, so that's one thing. Paradigms come into being horrifically and gradually, but for them to be hegemonic in the clinical sense of the word, they have to structure relations globally. That doesn't mean that they're going to be the same performance is going to be global. It means that's a structural relation global. Okay, so what we're saying, what Patterson has argued in Slavery and Social Death is one point that I take away, and then there's a point that we add as Afro-Pessimists. His point is that just to have a world, a society, where at a certain level, a high level of abstraction, the people in the society can think concepts in whatever language, concepts of freedom, concepts of community, concepts of collective organization and reciprocity. Just to have that, whether you organize that in Russia or in Brazil, just to have that, there's got to be this space over here where there are sentient beings who do not have that. In other words, what he's trying to say is that slavery is necessary to the thinking of community. And he's saying that everyone in the world has enslaved someone, and everyone in the world has been a slave. So the Ashanti, prior to, in the 500 AD, were enslaving people. The Buganda were enslaving people. The Choctaw, long before Columbus came, were making slaves of people. If we think of slavery as an abstract thing where someone is outside of the civic world and available to the civic world for its uses. Now, that's one thing. The second thing is that in 625 AD, something begins to happen, which I can't prove, so I'm just going to give you the claims because we don't have time. Something begins to happen, just like what Marx is talking about in the middle of the 19th century, where this new thing is emerging. This new thing for Marx in 1869 is called worker capitalist. It's not, it's been evolving for 200 years, and it's spreading across the globe. This new thing is called Black. And why is it new? It's new because it is the only entity which did not have a life prior to slavery. That is a very interesting thing. In other words, in the collective unconscious of civil society, we've got Moroccan Jews. In this period, we've got the Gulf state people, we've got Iranians, and we've got East Indians who are beginning to have consensus. Anything on 2 feet, Sahara and north of what is now Cape Town, are slaves a priori. That's new in history because there's never been an entity that is slave a priori. And that, we're saying, structures the entire world. In other words, even if a place, so we're talking 625 AD to the present, it begins to spread its tentacles out. And what we're saying is that baseline structure, to have a world, to have a community, you have to have a slave. That's baseline. Number 2, new baseline structure, meaning from 625 AD to the present, Blackness is the place of social death par excellence. So even if someone has not, to come full circle to your question, not encountered Blackness, and I would argue that by the end of the 19th century, there really isn't a place where people don't know Blackness as slaveness. And I would argue that slaveness is necessary for having community, regardless of the year, and that after 625 AD, Blackness comes onto the stage as the quintessential slave that was never anything but slave. And that's a paradigmatic argument, which is causing friction inside of African American studies, as well as friction in the humanities, because what the humanities have given people unconsciously is a past of plenitude, and then oppression comes. And we're saying, no, for Blackness, there is no past of plenitude. It is instantiated by gratuitous violence, and it never evolves into anything else, because if it were, then that guy in the ride to the airport would be part of the community of those other 3 people, and that would mean that their community would lose its conceptual coherence, as if to say, felines could be canines. Then we have no difference between dog and cat.
Okay, that's a great answer. Now, we only have a few minutes left. I would like to throw one last question at you.
Okay.
And it is about the policy implications of your argument. I believe you stated that Afro-Pessimism is primarily an explication of the problem of race. And I think you have shown us that. But you argue that it is not a policy prescription. But surely Black activists comprise a meaningful segment of your audience. In light of your diagnosis of the problem, what are they to do?
It's like a doctor who says you have cancer.
Oh dear.
And you say, okay, where's the vaccine for that? And he says the vaccine is death. I mean, look, I'm being provocative because we're so short on time. Afro-pessimism is also an interrogation of the way thought is thought. And since Matthew Arnold wrote Culture and Anarchy, if not before, our view is that the Anglo-American pedagogic imagination has been hobbled by its need to shackle diagnosis with cure. And so we are against the world, not for rejuvenation of relations within the world, because we say that world making is structurally anti-Black. That's number one. Number two, I don't think it's possible to write, if you say to me, the antagonist of the worker is the capitalist, and I move through the 3 volumes of Marx, I mobilize a revolution, I destroy the capitalist, I destroy the worker, and on the other side, I emerge with the proletariat and the end of surplus value. You cannot conceptually think of what is on the other side of the human, because we're in an umbrella or a dome under which human thought is constructed by this antagonism between the human and the Black. What we can say is that it is not organic, it is constructed, but you can't really say what policies, because you're asking the question really, what policies would make Blacks more human or have the values or the rights of humans, and it's humanness which needs to get Blackness out of that in order to be. But it does do one thing.
What I'm really asking is what, not even as abstract as policy, but what should Black people do? How should they cease organizing? Should Black Lives Matter go away? What about the NAACP? Is it all just hopeless?
I think it's a kind of hope that is generative of Black joy at the expense of the joy of everyone else. So it is not hopeless. But what I see, I do a lot of workshops for Black Lives Matter organizations in various cities. And one of the things I say is that the world is constructed in antithesis to us, but you cannot organize in the Black community with the Fanonian end of the world. You have to organize for better housing, end of police brutality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these moments of Black movement allow for us to have an expanded dialogue about the problem. And this is what Afro-Pessimism is doing. That's number one. So we cannot actually, we have to fight for better rights, but we also have to understand that rights as a generic category are anti-Black. That's number one. The second point is that, specific to your question, a lot of Black organizing is really anger management. Anger management of the unchecked, undirected, unchanneled, imaginative, explosive rage of Black youth. And I learned this working in a retirement home in Oakland, Black people who have left institutional life. I think that at those two ends of the spectrum, what you have is a psychic embodiment of Black people who do not feel shackled to the questions of institutional reform. And so what you have is a spirit of rage against the world that Afro-Pessimism as a theory is symptomatic of and gives permission to. And so concretely, what has been happening is that this theory has allowed youth and the old people that I work with to not have to be hammered or shackled by middle-aged Black political organizers saying, but yeah, where's that gonna get us? We need a policy. You know, it's like my grandmother said, mad at the world. And I think that kind of, I would say anecdotally, Henry Louis Gates said the horrible thing about Haiti was that they burned everything. And I say, no, the horrible thing about Haiti is that they didn't cross over to Florida and start burning everything in the United States.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up now. We only have a minute left. So I'm going to say that we thank Professor Wilderson for talking with us today. And we thank our audience for watching this interview. You can buy this book on Amazon in hardcover, on Kindle, or on Audible. Dr. Wilderson has read it, and I would encourage our viewers to think about listening to it rather than reading it. Thank you very much. We'll be offering in-home programming next time, and we'll see you then.